I was on the concrete bench outside Vanderbilt, holding a paper cup gone cold, like heat could pass through skin if I begged it. Inside, the ICU kept Daniel under that sterile white the machines prefer. Green numbers blinking a grammar I know too well. 3 weeks of blood counts like bad omens. HGB, PLT, ANC. Letters I used to recite like passwords as a nurse. Now each value is a thorn. Aplastic anemia, the hematologist said. Such a tidy phrase for a marrow that has stopped wanting to make life's smallest workers. Best path, stem cell transplant. Lesser path, if hope is elastic, transfusions, immunosuppression, waiting. The path I hate, say the ending out loud. Daniel grew up in foster homes, his records scattered like boxes that never reached the right porch. No parents, no siblings, no known relatives to HLA type. You can find unrelated donors, yes, but time. Time is a blade you learn to hold by the edge. Every morning, the doctor walked in with a professional smile and a "let's keep watching," then left so the waiting could do its slow work. I left the ICU because I didn't want my tears to land on a hospital sheet. The Nashville wind threaded the breezeway. Chlorhexidine clung to my sleeves. I couldn't find a tidy place to put my panic, so I hid it at the bottom of the cup. 2 staffers passed behind me, talking just loud enough for a sentence to escape. Looks exactly like Carter, especially the blue eyes. Where? Pine Hollow. Probably some distant relative. They could be twins, I looked up. Carter is Daniel's last name, but Vanderbilt has plenty of Carters. Still, the way she pressed on blue eyes tightened something behind my ribs. I don't traffic in miracles. I do recognize the survival instinct that hears a signal in static. Sorry, I stood, breath coffee bitter. Did you say Pine Hollow? They blinked. I flashed my nurse badge. My husband is Daniel Carter, ICU bed 11. He needs a marrow donor. If there's someone who looks exactly like him, do you know a name? They exchanged a guilty glance. We're not sure, the blonde said softly. We just heard there's a man in Pine Hollow who looks a lot like him. I'm sorry. It's okay. The word alike stuck to the inside of my skull like a post-it. Back in 11, Daniel slept. Skin a shade I've learned to despise. People say if you love long enough, the other person's breathing becomes background music. What I heard was a restless score. Monitor beeps for percussion. My heartbeat on counterpoint. I set my hand on his, the familiar pale rivers of vein under skin. Hey, I whispered. I'm stepping out. I'll come back. I'm going to look. An hour later, I was in the parking garage, driver's seat yanked close, legs shaking with a decision that didn't need permission. I handed off my patience, hugged Sabrina, my anchor these last weeks. Go, she said. If it were me, I'd go. Pine Hollow isn't far, but far enough to think every possibility to death. Stupid coincidence? Someone's idea of a joke? A fragment from Daniel's lost file? Or I'm just gripping a mirage? I killed the radio and watched the gray road jitter under the tires. I thought about every small promise I'd made and postponed. We'll do Smokies this weekend, okay? We spoke about trips the way you speak about dessert, someday. Then one day, the main course disappears. In a town the size of a rumor, strangers become the cafe's business. The bell above the first general store chimed me into a test I didn't study for. The owner stared with an expression that means, say what you need. I opened my phone. Daniel in our backyard, sawdust in his hair, grinning lopsided. Ma'am, I said, steady as I could, is there anyone here who looks like him? She didn't look surprised, which surprised me. She studied the photo, then nodded slowly. There is. Luke Henderson, County Road 6, same blue eyes. His mama once said, her sister left a baby at a hospital long ago. Her gaze shifted from challenge to pity. You came to the right place. County Road 6 is a pencil line through wet fields. A fine rain started, the kind that gives you time and then sinks in anyway. The house was wood with a porch, a shell chime, old rocker shivering in the wind, a pair of mud-stained boots. I breathed once, fixed my hair, and knocked. 2 heartbeats. The door opened. He filled the frame. Tall, solid, dark hair, a shadow beard, and those eyes. That exact blue I'd been arguing with all month. "Can I help you?" he said, voice gravel over water. I held out my phone, hands betraying me with a tremor. "You can tell me to leave. But look at this first." He glanced. Something flickered. Recognition, not shock. He pulled the door wider, waved me onto the porch. "You from Nashville?" "Yes." I gave him the shortest true story I could. "My husband is Daniel Carter. He needs a transplant. He has no family. I overheard someone say there's a man in Pine Hollow who looks just like him. So I came." He leaned on the jamb and stared through the rain like he was skimming a map. "My mother used to say her younger sister left a baby at a hospital. Nobody talked about why. My grandma raised me. The other boy disappeared from every sentence after that. I've always figured there's someone out there wearing half my face, and if we passed on a sidewalk, I'd turn around." He looked back at me. "I'm Luke." I told him my name and more detail. Counts, timelines, risks, the thin edge of hope. I showed him another photo, Daniel's rare deep smile, the small scar on his lip from a 9th grade bike crash. Luke touched the screen exactly where the scar lives, then let out a soft laugh like retrieving a dropped puzzle piece. "Okay," he said, "sure as a plumb line. Test me. If I match, I donate. When do we go?" "Are you certain?" It was a dumb question, given the speech I'd just delivered. "For 25 years, Luke said, I've thought about that other kid. If he's lying somewhere needing me, the answer was yesterday. Today will do." The rain thickened. We jogged to the car. I texted the team. Doctor, Sabrina, myself. Found a Luke Henderson. Bringing him. HL. A panel. A. S. AP. Replies stacked. Received. On it. Okay. On the drive back, Luke asked what needed asking. Risks. Procedure. Inpatient time. I answered like a nurse. Clear, simple, honest. Sometimes he watched the window and that eye, Daniel's eye in a different frame, flashed like an old promise. "Are you scared?" I asked. "I used to be scared of having no one," he said, half joke, half bone. "If I'm scared now, it means I've got something to lose." That's better. Vanderbilt looked one shade brighter when we pulled in. I walked Luke to the lab, hands steady until the HLA kit snapped open. The phlebotomist drew, labeled, rushed it. I pinged the attending. "Any way to fast lane this?" 3 minutes later, prioritizing. We went up to the ICU. Through glass, Daniel lay the way he has, except today there was a light beside me that hadn't existed. I touched his shoulder. "Dan," I whispered, "this is Luke." Daniel's eyes opened. The fatigue-speckled blue seemed to learn a new alignment. Luke hovered, hands searching for pockets. Suddenly a boy. "I think," Luke said, almost shy, "I'm your brother." The sentence punched through the thick gauze we'd wrapped around ourselves. Daniel blinked, looked at the eye that matched his own, and didn't smile. No energy, but his mouth tugged stubbornly. I always wanted a brother. We didn't hug. ICU is unkind to grand gestures. We stood and let the filtered air push music through the beeps. A nurse stepped in with a timed task. I led Luke into the hall. He braced the wall, inhaled like surfacing. "I imagined this," he said, "but not this quiet." "All the loud parts," I said, "are in there." We found the cafeteria and 2 waters. Waiting is the most useless task humans are assigned. I pictured centrifuges spinning, blood-shaking hands under lenses, the words match or not, arranging themselves. I promised myself, if it's no, I will still say thank you. If it's yes, I will relearn breathing. Near dusk, Sabrina texted, "Lab called? MD coming up." A light came on in a neglected room of my brain. The attending arrived with a different smile. Less math, more faith held carefully. "Preliminary HLA is back," he said. "Very strong. We'll confirm with the extended panel, but this is a match to be grateful for." I didn't sob. I set my hands on the table and rested my forehead on the backs like a prayer people do when words would only bruise the moment. Luke leaned back, eyes closing as if he'd just swum across a rough channel and felt sand under his feet. "How soon?" he asked. "If confirmatory moves quickly," the doctor said, "we can schedule your stem cell collection within days. We'll condition Daniel in parallel. I'll walk you both through everything I nodded. 1, 2, 3. In my head, checklists lit up. Consents, work up for Luke, who needs to sign, who needs to be present. I've shepherded other families through this. Nothing trained me for the sensation of a stranger deciding to save the person I love most. When the doctor left, Luke glanced at me, half serious, half rescue humor. "If we are brothers, do I get to roast his haircut?" "You can try," I said, "after transplant." That night in 11, Daniel watched me with less broken glass in his gaze. I told him everything slowly so each word could bridge his fatigue. "Very strong match," I said, and for the first time in weeks, my sentence wasn't a needle, it was a bandage. "You did the impossible," he whispered. "No," I shook my head. "I just overheard at the right time." "That's a talent," he breathed, amused. I sat by the bed, our fingers laced around tubing and wires like ivy. Outside, Nashville settled into a gentle night. I remembered I hadn't eaten anything that deserved the name. That problem belonged to tomorrow. Today, I was allowed to live inside a single word: match. Before I left, I called Daniel's foster mom, the quiet woman who had walked him out of a temporary house and into decency. She cried the kind of cry that lets the other person stay steady. "Honey," she said, "when people belong to each other, they find each other." I hung up, knowing it was both blessing and punctuation. I slept on a folding chair in the family room, back protesting, eyes tracing ceiling specks like constellations. I thought about tomorrow, lines, drips, failure that still exists, everything I can't control. Then I saw those blue eyes. One in 11, one in the guest lodge on 3, and noticed they didn't scare me anymore. 2 windows in the same house. A house misplaced for years, lights coming on. Morning arrived, as if someone had ironed the sky. The confirmatory HLA panel signed its name in black and white. High probability match. The consent parade began. Forms that made sense and forms that asked us to imagine outcomes we refused to rehearse. Luke listened the way good men do when they're deciding to be brave on purpose. He asked what would hurt and for how long. He asked what could go wrong and whether going wrong would land on Daniel instead of him. "It lands on both," the attending said, "but we stack odds." They set Luke up for peripheral blood stem cell collection. No anesthesia, just a few days of GCSF injections to coax stem cells into the bloodstream. Then hours on an apheresis machine. He took the first shot in his arm without flinching, though later he admitted it felt like a private storm in his bones. "Like 1,000 little hammers," he said, flexing his fingers. "I can live with that." Daniel started conditioning, chemo with names that taste like metal on the tongue, even when you're only reading them. The nurses taped a laminated list over his bed like a recipe that saves lives. I watched the bags drain the way you watch a tide you have to trust. I watched his color drain and promised myself not to read too much into it. Between doses, I wheeled Daniel outside to the garden that hospitals keep for plausible hope. We sat under a maple and looked at a sky that wasn't in a hurry. Luke met us there after shot 2, pale, in a way men go pale when they don't want to perform discomfort. He handed Daniel a pack of mints. "For the metal mouth," he said. Daniel smiled without showing teeth. "Brother Perks," he said, and the word brother stood on new legs and didn't wobble. Nights were a choreography of small kindnesses, the warm blanket machine, Sabrina's contraband broth in a thermos, the respiratory therapist who kept his jokes short. I learned the underbreath sound Daniel made when the nausea came and learned how not to panic when the sound stopped. I learned the names of the phlebotomists and how each one apologized for waking him like it was a new idea. On day 4 of GCSF, Luke couldn't find a comfortable way to exist. "Bones are loud," he muttered, trying to sit, then stand, then pace. I brought him a heating pad and a bad cup of coffee. "I don't know how you do this every day," he said. "Be here for all of it." I wanted to say I don't know either, but what came out was what nurses say when we forget to protect ourselves. We watch, and we make the next small thing happen. The morning of collection, they settled Luke into a chair with more tubing than dignity. The apheresis machine hummed like a serious bee. Blood left, circled, returned. A clear bag slowly caught the cream of it. Cells you can't name by eye. Enough, we hoped, to rebuild a marrow that had given notice. Luke watched the bag with the focused boredom of someone timing rain. "If I pass out, tell me I did it heroically," he said. He did not pass out. He told 2 bad jokes and 1 good one. The nurse labeled the bag the way one labels a newborn's bracelet. I carried the consent copies back to Daniel like talismans. He let me read the lines that were meant for physicians, as if language might be medicine too. When the bag arrived, double-checked, barcoded, cross-verified with a seriousness that felt like prayer, the room changed temperature without changing temperature. The transplant itself, anticlimactically, looked like any other transfusion. Red flowing into red while the little beeps behaved. The attending stood with hands clasped the way some people stand at baptisms. Luke watched from the doorway, face blank with concentration, eyes bright with something he hadn't been taught to name. "Thank you," Daniel said to him, voice thin. "You'll pay me back by living," Luke said. "Interest rates are brutal." We laughed because it was the right size thing to do. Then the clock switched to another kind of time. Engraftment is a waiting room without chairs. It's fevers that may mean everything or nothing. It's numbers you try not to turn into prophecy. Absolute neutrophil count, platelets, retics, it's mouth sores, and the way water takes courage. It's me learning which corridor hum means pharmacy and which means lab, because I needed to pretend I could decode the future. The first fever hit on day +2. The monitor tattled before I could pretend otherwise. Cultures, broad-spectrum antibiotics, the dance you do when you refuse to let bacteria write plot. Daniel shook with it, jaw a metronome, hands a staccato. I pushed warm blankets and held the basin and rubbed his shoulders in the space nurse's leave for love. "This is the part we expected," I said, and hated myself for the way honesty sometimes sounds like distance. Luke haunted the family lounge, useless in the way donors are forced to be useless once they've bled the good they can bleed. I found him staring out a window that framed a brick wall. "He's in the hard part," he said. "I don't want to be the guy who asks every hour if it's still the hard part." "You can be here?" I said. "That's the job." He nodded, jaw working. "When this is over, when if becomes then, you're going to have to teach me what it means to be an older brother. You start with rides to urgent care and terrible advice about dating," I said. "We can scale up from there." Day +5 brought a dip that made the room feel steeper. Daniel's counts bottomed out the way they're supposed to, and still somehow managed to take you by surprise. He slept like a man hiding. I watched the pump and the line and the pail inside his lip. And my hands did that thing hands do when the brain is tired. They sought work. I straightened. I charted. I refilled. I fought the urge to bargain with gods I don't keep on retainer. On day +7, a number rounded up. A small number. A could be. Don't celebrate yet, the fellow said. And we didn't. We smiled into our sleeves. On +8, the number doubled. On +9, I bought a ridiculous balloon and hid it in a closet like contraband joy. On +10, Sabrina texted a row of sun emojis she would mock herself for later. On +11, the attending walked in with that carefully casual posture doctors use when they're about to let themselves be human. We're seeing early engraftment, he said. Keep doing exactly this. Exactly this meant more waiting with purpose. It meant Daniel's mouth hurting a little less, and water tasting like water again. It meant Luke working out how to visit without hovering, how to sit without making his presence a test. He brought crossword puzzles and lost on purpose. He brought a photo of the creek behind his place in Pine Hollow and said, "When you can walk to the end of the hall without bargaining, we'll go listen to this." We had visitors who knew how to stand at the correct distance and visitors who didn't. We had a chaplain who understood that silence is not an empty offering. We had a nurse on night shift who sang under her breath when she primed lines. We had an oncologist who wrote his cell number on the whiteboard as if that could stop 3 a.m. from being 3 a.m. There were bad hours tucked in the good days, a rash that threatened to be graft versus host and then remembered its manners. A hiccup in electrolytes that made Daniel's muscles twitch like fish do when memory tries to leave the body. A night when nausea won and pride lost, and I learned again how much love fits into rinsing a bowl. Through it all, Luke kept showing up. He said little. He learned our shorthand. When I forgot to eat, a sandwich appeared. When Daniel drifted, Luke sat where he could be seen without needing to be read. He told us small stories about the time he tried to build a chicken coop that the chickens hated, about his grandmother's insistence that soup solves politics, about a summer he thought he saw his other half in a Knoxville crowd and followed a stranger for 2 blocks before Mercy caught up. "Did you ever imagine it like this?" Daniel asked him one afternoon, voice a little less borrowed. Luke shook his head. "I imagined a movie." This is better. It's slower. Slower is a kind of mercy, too. It allowed me to notice the way Daniel's hands stopped shaking first thing in the morning. It gave us the half-smile he started pulling off when the fellow attempted a joke. It held a space big enough for me to put my fear down for a minute without losing track of it. On +14, the attending said the word platelets in a tone you use for birthdays. Transfusion needs waned. Bruce's considered their options. Daniel slept without the same grim set to his mouth. I peeled the balloon out of the closet and tied it to the chair with a contrite note. I waited. I promise I waited. Daniel laughed in a whisper. "Felony-level restraint," he said. That evening, we wheeled him to the window at the end of the hall, the one with the lonely philodendron and a view of the parking lot's ordinary miracles. The sunset did a small, decent thing with color. Luke stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, as if guarding the door between the day we were in and the day we wanted. A volunteer came by with a cart of paperbacks and asked whether anyone wanted a thriller. "We've had enough plot," I said. "Do you have anything about gardens?" She did. We read 2 pages out loud, soil pH and stubborn tomatoes, and it sounded like a foreign language we were taking a liking to. Discharge planning crept in like an optimist. The team talked about home precautions, masks in grocery stores, the alphabet of prophylaxis. Luke asked what he could do to make our house safer. Filters, bleach, how to argue with dust. "Don't argue," the nurse said. "Invite it to leave." That night, I climbed into the recliner and stared at my hands. A month ago, I had thought they were only good for catching and carrying. Now they were also good for letting go, not of Daniel, of the version of myself who believed I had to hold the whole field in place. I sent a text to Daniel's foster mom. Early engraftment. He's here. She replied with a voice memo of her humming a hymn off-key. I played it at half volume and didn't feel foolish for liking it. On plus 16, the attending used the phrase, medically appropriate to consider discharge timing. Bureaucratic poetry. I let myself picture the driveway, the front steps, the door we'd clean 3 times a day because Faith and Bleach are cousins. Luke texted a photo from Pine Hollow. At dusk, porch light, the old rocker, the line of woods becoming suggestion. When he's ready, he wrote, "We'll put a chair beside mine." I fell asleep to the thought of 2 chairs. At dawn on plus 17, I woke to the sound of Daniel asking for coffee, not to drink, just to smell. I brought the cup like contraband worship. He closed his eyes, breathed, and returned it as if the ritual itself had calories. Rounds brought numbers that wanted to be trusted. We started practicing the living parts, walking the loop, taking showers like ceremonies, saying yes to broth. Luke timed us like a coach training a team for an untelevised event. "You did an extra door frame," he said when we passed the second nurse station. "That's a trophy." He left that afternoon to drive back to Pine Hollow, check on his grandmother's house, grab a few things. "You two need anything?" he asked at the door. "Bring me a rock from the creek," Daniel said, flat enough to skip but too pretty to throw. Luke saluted like a man who'd never been in the service and made it look like he had. "I'll be back tomorrow." When he was gone, the room felt like a shirt after you take off a heavy necklace. Lighter, but you miss the weight. I sat beside Daniel and let silence speak. He squeezed my hand with a grip that didn't pretend. "Stay," he said, though I hadn't moved. We watched the monitor do its unsexy, essential job. Nurses drifted in and out, night change shifts with afternoon, and hope, noisy when it's young, learned to walk quieter in our room. Outside, Nashville lit itself street by street. I closed my eyes and finally let the word then replace if for a single, unguarded minute. The discharge note read like a door held open. Follow-up dates, lab draws, mask rules, the alphabet of pills. The nurse had me repeat the instructions until both our voices sounded practiced. Daniel signed, and the pen didn't shake. He tucked the flat stone Luke brought from the creek into his palm as if it had a temperature. Flat enough to skip, but too pretty to throw. It waited on the windowsill while I sipped our bag. We moved slowly, the way you learn to move when your life consists of measured distances. To the elevator, to the car, to the curb where Sabrina hugged me with one arm and slipped a freezer pack of broth into my tote with the other. "For the first night," she said. "Text me the minute you're in." Home had been waiting with its lights off but its memory on. I wiped every surface like a superstition with spray. Daniel sat in the armchair by the window, mask on, eyes on the sky that Nashville wore when it was practicing mercy. Thin clouds, a polite sun. I set the medication boxes in a row and read the labels the way you read place names on a map you don't want to get lost in. Tacro, a cyclovir, a list of small shields against bad luck. Daniel sniffed the coffee I brewed and smiled without tasting. That evening, the house hummed like it was learning our names again. Luke texted, "On the road at dawn. Save me a spot on that sidewalk." I replied with a picture of the creek rock on the windowsill. It has opinions about where to live. The first week was a choreography of cautious living. We practiced the hallway loop like a religion. 3 laps before lunch, 4 before dinner. Daniel learned which chair was the good breathing chair and which was for the news when the news could be tolerated. I learned to say enough to visitors whose kindness would have outrun our capacity. I put a small bell on the kitchen timer and pretended it was a nurse call. At night, when the house was a lattice of lamplight, we told the kind of stories you tell when you don't want to talk about the big thing. The time Daniel tried to make ravioli and admitted store-bought was a sacrament. The time I slipped on black ice and didn't swear because a child was holding my mitten. The time Luke mistakenly built his chicken coop door too low and spent an afternoon belly crawling with feed like a penitent. Courage refreshed itself in small laughter. Luke arrived on a Wednesday that smelled like rain reheating. He didn't knock like a guest. He paused like family. We stood 6 feet apart as instructed. Then Daniel waved him in with the rock. "You can come closer," he said. Luke hesitated, then did. He put a paper bag on the table, mint from the porch, a jar of his grandmother's soup, a photograph of the creek at noon. "Consider the soup an argument I intend to win," he said. They sat across from each other with the attentive amazement of two men who were not boys together and would never be, but had decided not to hold it against the present. "I got your text about being an older brother," Luke said. "Lesson 1. When a man says he's fine, check the color behind his ears." Daniel reached up, touched the skin there, then laughed. "Still pale?" "Tragically," Luke said. "We'll fix it." He stayed 3 hours and left when he should have, not when the story wanted him to. After he went, the house kept his shape, the way rooms do when something new has been invited in and the walls need time to learn it. On the second week home, we did something that felt illegal. We walked to the end of the block. Daniel wore a brimmed hat that made him look like himself from before and a mask that insisted on now. Every 11 steps, we paused. Dog walkers negotiated arcs around us like choreography. The sun performed restraint. We turned back at the mailbox with the brass numbers I'd never noticed until the day they looked like proof. "We did the extra door frame," Daniel said, grinning under fabric. "Coach would be proud." We sent Luke a photo of the sky at the turnaround spot. He sent back a porch, 2 chairs, and a caption. "We're collecting horizons." Recovery learned its own calendar. There were days when numbers behaved like students who knew the lesson. There were days when they slouched and pretended confusion. A rash flared, and we fed it pills and patience. A night cough tried to rehearse drama, then forgot its lines. I set alarms for tack row, for walking, for water, for the moment I should stop Googling. When fear woke me at 3, I counted medication bottles by touch and named Daniel's breaths like rosary beads. On a Friday, when everything smelled newly laundered, the doorbell rang and the camera showed Josie from next door, 2 bags of groceries in her hands. "I sanitized the handles," her text read, "and yes, I judged the produce for you." She left before I opened the door. I cried in the kitchen, quickly, for the ordinary kindness of oranges and a note that said, "Fresh time for soup." We scheduled the first clinic return. Daniel sat in the exam room chair like it had been designed by someone with a half memory of comfort. The attending flipped through labs and said numbers I wanted to tattoo. "No signs of acute GVHD," he said. "Counts holding." He looked at Daniel the way you look at a bridge after a storm. He looked at me the way people look at someone who is accidentally vertical. "You're doing it," he said, as if we had asked. On the way home, we took the long route to pass the park. The swings were empty. 2 crows argued over something small. Daniel closed his eyes and put his face in the sun like a plant. "I can smell the mulch," he said, surprised. I couldn't smell anything. I decided he had earned the better nose. Luke came on Sundays. He taught Daniel solitaire variants like languages and lost each on purpose, then accidentally won one and looked guilty. He told us about Pine Hollow's annual fair that involved pies and bragging and a quilt raffle his grandmother insisted on entering. He replaced the wobbly bolt on our back gate without fanfare. He asked for a list of chores and refused to call it a list. It's a menu, he said. I'm hungry for work. On one Sunday, he stood on the porch with Daniel and the creek rock and measured something with his eyes. I'm thinking we put a chair here, he said. You sit in the morning and insult the birds. Daniel nodded, like a man who knew the utility of a place to rest. We ordered a wooden rocker with a slatted back and a seat that would fit a careful body. It arrived with the instructions written in a font that believed in optimism. Luke assembled it with the kind of concentration men in movies save for diffusing bombs. When it was done, he sat first, then stood up fast like he'd broken a rule. Daniel sat next, leaned back an inch, then another, and let out a sound that belonged in an older house. Perfect, he said. The rocker accepted the compliment by being exactly itself. On day plus 45, Daniel asked for scissors. I stared until he clarified. The back, he said. I want to feel lighter. I cut slowly, the way you cut when hair is both hair and history. We left the floor clean. We put the clippings in the trash because I refused to invent rituals for what didn't need them. He looked in the mirror and found a man he recognized. Better, he said. I was surprised by how much I agreed. A letter came from Vanderbilt's volunteer office, printed on sincere paper. Dear Luke Henderson, it began, we don't have a category for what you did, so we will call it extraordinary kindness and be content with the understatement. Luke read it at our table and shrugged it off like jackets you return to racks. Daniel took the letter from him and slid it into a folder labeled Keep. He didn't label many things that way. We planned a drive to Pine Hollow for a short visit, masked, timed, approved. The day we went, the sky had that particular southern blue that remembers heat even when the air is mild. The highway unspooled. The town sign appeared with no ceremony. Luke led us to the creek, where the water did its old work in its old voice. Daniel stood on the bank and let the sound do what it does to tired nerves. This is louder than a hospital, he said, grateful. Luke handed him a flat stone, and Daniel threw it weakly. It hopped once and forgave him for the rest. At the house, Luke's grandmother had left a note with a drawing of a spoon. Soup in the blue pot. Do not salt before you taste. Daniel ate 4 spoonfuls and put the lid back on, like a man who understands limits and wants to keep them. In the yard, 2 chairs faced the trees. Luke dragged a third out of the shed. For the days you feel greedy, he said. We drove back at dusk, Daniel asleep, the creek rock warm in my pocket. I held the wheel and let a small thought sit down beside me. The worst had not been guaranteed, and the best was not a requirement. What we had was a string of enoughs tied together. On day plus 72, the clinic declared the phrase stable course, and I let it echo until it became decoration. We made spaghetti and ate it at the table like people who were allowed to. Noah from down the hall knocked and asked if we needed the ladder. I said yes, even though we didn't, and let him change the light bulb that had outstubborned me for a month. A neighbor left marigold seedlings on the stoop. Daniel pressed soil around them with careful fingers. Next year, he said, more color. I wrote it in the margin of the calendar. The first time we forgot to talk about labs for an entire evening, we noticed at the sink while washing 2 plates and 1 pan. We did it, Daniel said. We were ordinary. I put the plates in the rack like trophies. We can try again tomorrow, I said. We set a day for the porch chairs to meet. Luke arrived with a bag of peaches and a grin he tried to keep inside his face and failed. The 3 of us sat, and the rocker made that modest wooden sound old houses approve of. Cars passed. A child on a scooter negotiated the sidewalk with earnest competence. The air moved without asking. Family's weird, Luke said after a while, not unhappily. Accurate, Daniel said. We can be weird on schedule, I offered. Sundays at 4, soup optional, chair mandatory. We made it a rule. That night, after the porch turned the color of things that have earned their quiet, I tidied the meds, set the timer, backed up the calendar to 2 places because superstition and systems get along. I stood at the sink and watched the window hold the last light. Inside, Daniel slept with his hand on the creek rock like an anchor the size of a palm. On the table, the letter to Luke waited to be finished. "There aren't enough categories," I wrote, borrowing the volunteer office's line, so we'll make one. Brother, noun. Also, miracle. The kind that puts chairs on porches. Before bed, I went to the door and turned the deadbolt. The click had a new register. I'd heard it before, in another life, as proof that a boundary could be kept. Now it sounded like a promise with a porch attached. I leaned my forehead against the wood and let the house answer. It did, politely, by settling 1 inch closer to where it meant to be. In the morning, I woke to the smell of coffee Daniel was allowed to taste. 1 sip for ritual. The marigold stood scandalously cheerful in the box. The rock kept being a rock. The chairs kept being chairs. We had no ceremonies planned, no emergencies, no news urgent enough to interrupt eggs. I poured 2 cups and took one to the porch. The sky was considerate. Somewhere down the block, a dog announced an opinion. I sat, breathed, and let the day begin without asking it to justify itself. When Daniel joined me, he handed me the flat stone and said, "Hold this a second." I did. It was warm from his hand. "Do you want to go to the creek again?" I asked. "Soon," he said. "Today, here is enough." We watched the street become itself. I thought of the bench at Vanderbilt and the overheard sentence, of Pine Hollow and a door opening, of a bag filling with cells you can't see, and a number rounding up and a balloon hidden in a closet, of soup that won arguments and chairs that learned names, of a rock that traveled from water to windowsill and decided to stay. When the thought came, small and without music, "We're still here," I didn't push it away in case it changed its mind. I let it sit beside the coffee and the rock and the chair, one more ordinary thing that held.